Hey everybody, happy first Friday of December. 2020 is finally coming to a close. Not that I expect 2021 to be all that different, at least for the first 6 to 9 months, but at least we don't have an election on top of it. As some of you know who follow me on Instagram, I posted something Monday night. I had a rough weekend and nothing happened. Nothing out of the ordinary happened in the least, but suddenly it just all seemed like it was too much. And I posted something kind of personal Monday on my Instagram, which I never do. It's always just about a book. And the outpouring of positive comments and support from the bookish community was just overwhelming. It was almost more painful to me than the weekend was because it was so nice. And I can't thank you all enough for your kindness and your support. We're all going through the same nonsense endlessly, and at times it's harder to take than others, and that's the way it was for me last weekend. And so this week has been somewhat better. I've been getting busy ramping up the prep work for next year's Booktube Prize, contacting publishers, trying to get last minute review copies of books that I wasn't able to get earlier in the year because of the pandemic when all the offices were shut, preparing the software, things like that. One thing, and I'll talk about this much more in an email to the judges that I just learned yesterday that is really going to help, is that there's been an additional module written for the software that I use. As those of you who have been with us for a couple of years know that I'm using essentially a speech and debate program that I used to run tournaments with back when I was coaching. And I've modified it just a little bit to work for what we need for the Booktube Prize. But what the software developer, Ben, who's a good friend of mine, has done is he's had to react to the pandemic as well, because most speech and debate tournaments can't happen in person anymore. So they all happen via distance competition. They do live videos for their rounds instead of being in person. And so he had to develop a way of allowing judges who were also in remote locations to submit ballots, which are normally done on paper. And so he wrote an electronic balloting module for the SpeechWire program, which we're going to try to use this year. It will allow me to do a lot more things in an automated fashion instead of manually, which is good both for my time and also for accuracy. And it will also allow judges to submit their ballots directly into the program itself. So I don't have to duplicate that effort and enter all those ballots individually and manually. And it will allow me to keep track of who's already submitted ballots, who still has to submit ballots. So there's going to be a little bit of a change in how you turn in your ballots next year. But in the long run, this is a really good development for the prize, especially as we're approaching 200 judges. As of this morning, we have 187 judges signed up, so I'm thrilled with that. I'd love to get those last 13 to reach the 200 mark, which was my goal for the year. So if you have friends or contacts who you think would be good judges for the Booktube Prize for 2021, please send them to just the main page of the Booktube Prize website will do, booktubeprize.org. There is a link to the introduction video and a link to the sign-up page on that website. So please get your friends to sign up. Let's hit that 200 mark. And then next year, as we go into year 4, we can talk about expanding into a third division, which everybody seems to want us to do. Okay, so enough about business and personal things. I did finish earlier in the week 2 books. Both were tangentially in the Shakespearean world. And it was strictly by chance. I didn't plan it that way. They just happened to be the next 2 books that were on my shelf that caught my eye. The first one is Shakespeare for Squirrels by Christopher Moore. If you don't know Christopher Moore, let me tell you a little bit about my journey with him. Back when I owned my bookstore, and this was in the early 90s, mid 90s, I picked up a book on my shelf that I hadn't seen before. I got kind of a standard opening shipment from my distributor, and some of the books I did not know. And there was a book there that had a cartoon picture of a white whale kind of breaching a little bit. And on the bottom of the flukes of the whale were the words, "Bite me." I thought, what the heck is this? And it's a book called Fluke. Turns out, and I'm not giving you a spoiler because you learned this real early on, the whale that's being pictured there is actually a submarine. But Christopher Moore writes about horror conventions, but he does it in such a funny way that even somebody like me who does not read horror absolutely finds his books hilarious. He's written 17 novels now. I don't know, a ton of them. Some of the early ones are my favorites. He wrote one called The Lust Lizard of Melancholy Cove. And the opening scene is a Godzilla-like character comes out of the lagoon, I believe in California, because he's from San Francisco, and immediately falls in love and tries to mount an Exxon gasoline truck. And it goes downhill from there. His take on the vampire convention, which was all the rage years ago, he wrote one called Blood-Sucking Fiends, a love story. And it is. And then he wrote a follow-up to that a few years later called You Suck, a love story, following the same characters further down the road. So he just takes those horror conventions and flips them in really hilarious ways. He's probably most well known for his book called Lamb. It's the gospel according to Biff, Christ's childhood pal. And it fills in the missing years in Christ's chronology, including scenes like Christ has a real crush and wants to get with Mary Magdalene, but he knows he can't. So he has Biff sleep with her and then describe it to him. So it's very irreverent. It is hysterical, and if you like that kind of thing, you've got 17 books in his body of work to choose from. In his most recent books, he's turned to the world of Shakespeare. 3 out of his last 4 books have been Shakespearean, sort of. He went with a character who is a jester, a fool, in the first book in this series, which was just called Fool, which is a retake on Shakespeare's King Lear. And this is near and dear to my heart because my senior year in high school, I took English independent study because I was cocky and thought I'd find a way to get out of all the work of senior English. Well, that backfired gloriously, and I ended up writing a research paper on the Fool in King Lear, the most work I've ever done in high school. And I still thank Mrs. Knudsen to this day. She's probably responsible for me going to graduate school in English. I don't know if she's still with us. I hope she is. She's certainly not watching this video, but wherever you are, Mrs. Knudsen, thank you. But so I read that one, and it was hilarious. The main character, his name is Pocket, of Dogs Knocking on Ooze. And he shows up in the other 2 Shakespeare books, too. The second one is The Serpent of Venice, which Christopher Moore obviously wrote a riff on The Merchant of Venice, but he did it basically because he wanted to write about a monster in the canals of Venice. And then this most recent one, Squirrels for Shakespeare, is a takeoff on A Midsummer Night's Dream, again, with the main character of Pocket. So if you like those kinds of things, don't expect it to be Shakespearean in terms of literature. It is just good fun. He is like Carl Hyacin in my last video. Christopher Moore is one of my go-to automatic reads when a new book of his comes out. They're just comfort reads for me, and I absolutely adore them. The second one I read was much more serious, and that is Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet, which I believe won the Women's Prize this year. And I have not read the other books that were in contention for the Women's Prize yet, so I don't know if the committee got it right, but they sure picked an awesomely good book for their winner this year. It tells the story of Shakespeare's family in Stratford, his meeting and marrying his wife. History remembers her primarily as Anne Hathaway, but in her father's will, she's identified as Agnes. And so O'Farrell uses the name Agnes throughout this book. You never even learn the name Hathaway in this book. It's just about Agnes. And you learn about his three children, Susanna, his first daughter, and then his twins, Judith and Hamnet. And it's about the years where Shakespeare is trying to break away from an abusive father who's the glove maker in Stratford and is going to London and starting to make his name as an actor, a player, and a playwright. And it's really focused more on Shakespeare's family in this book. In fact, the name Shakespeare is never mentioned one time in this book. You just know who it is because we know enough about Shakespeare. But she has taken the bare bones documentary records we have of Shakespeare's biography and has written a fictional account of a year of the plague in which his son Hamnet dies. And then 4 years later, it leads to him writing the play Hamlet. Hamnet and Hamlet are basically the same name at that time. And so it's really about the family and how this death affects the family, how Shakespeare's moving to London affects the family. And I just think it's remarkably well done. It's very easy to read, even if you don't know. You don't have to know anything about the play Hamlet to enjoy this book. But I think Maggie O'Farrell just nailed it. This was an easy 5-star decision for me, and I'll be real surprised if it doesn't get legs in next year's Booktube Prize. It's just a book that seems to capture most people's attention. Not everybody's going to love it. There's always going to be somebody who doesn't take to it, but I think it's fairly universally loved on Booktube. So those are the two Shakespearean books that I finished. I am about 2/3 of the way finished with Douglas Stewart's book, Shuggie, Bain, which won the Booker Prize recently. And at first, I wasn't really getting into it too much. But like I said, last week, I think it was me, it wasn't the book. And because I was struggling with concentration, I added the audiobook after I had already read about 100 pages. And that has made all the difference. From that point on, I've been able to concentrate and focus, and I'm enjoying the book a lot more. I'll talk more about it next week after I've finished it, but I'm not sure I like it as much as Hamnet. I think both of them will be in the running for our prize next year. They both have received a lot of attention because of the prizes they've already won. The BookTube Prize doesn't always choose the same winners as other prizes, but sometimes it does. So we'll see. For those of you who are following along with the Barter Hordes Backlist Book Club, our December selection, which we've just started reading, is Anita Brookner's novel, Brief Lives. You're welcome to join us for that discussion if you'd like. We read for the first 3 weeks of the month, so the 1st through the 21st, and then we start our discussion on the 22nd of each month, and the discussion goes as long as it goes. We are currently voting on our January selection, and we'll know that in a couple of days. If you'd like to join that book club, it's hosted completely on Voxer, which is a free app if you're not familiar with Voxer. You can get me to add you to that discussion group if you'll go on Voxer, set up an account, and just send me a personal message through Voxer, not through email or any other message, but through Voxer. Then I can immediately pull you into that discussion and you can join us on whichever books fit your fancy. So that's what I've been reading. As far as watching, I've watched a lot of Kdramas. Obviously, I continue to do that. I just want to focus on two of them. One is an absolutely absurd comedy that I watched as part of our K-drama appreciation group, where we watch one episode a day and then chuckle on Voxer about the ridiculous nature of everything that happened in that day's episode. And that is called Welcome to Waikiki. It's not actually set in Hawaii. It's a bunch of young people in Seoul who set up a guest house called Waikiki. And it's 3 guys, 3 girls, absolute insanity. Every single episode is just absurd, and they're all funny. And there is the cutest baby in history throughout this series. And that little baby's reactions. I don't know how many times they must have had to film her to get the perfect reactions, but she makes most of the episodes. And so we finished that in November. The other one that I just watched and finished this weekend, which may have had something to do with my emotional mood this weekend, because this was a really emotional series for me, is called Descendants of the Sun. The story is based around a woman doctor in Seoul who is trying to become a professor at the teaching hospital, and she's the most qualified by far, but she keeps getting passed over for people who have connections, and it's driving her crazy. And by chance, she meets two Korean Army Special Forces soldiers who are at the hospital with a patient. And then she meets them again a couple of times. And so there's this feeling of fate in their repeated meetings. And she gets hit upon by the chairman of the hospital, who basically thinks that, he can have her in his power, since she wants the professorship. And she slaps him. She just won't have it. And so in retaliation, he sends her as part of this volunteer group from the hospital to a Balkans country where they are establishing a power plant, and they have a medical team there. And so she's forced to go as part of this medical team. Well, you can guess who's there: the two Korean Special Forces soldiers. And so their lives keep coming back into contact with each other, and it is a very touching, very well written. There's a lot of witty dialogue and banter in this one right from the very first episode. I had to stop after the first 5 minutes because I was laughing so hard at the banter. And I just found this one just remarkable. This is easily one of my top 4 or 5 K-dramas in the year that I've been watching. I've now watched, I believe I'm on my 50th series, and this one's easily in the top 4 or 5. So if you and this one's not on Netflix. This one is on Viki.com, Viki.com. If you have an interest in that one, it's called Descendants of the Sun, and it is just wonderful. The last thing I want to talk about today is I have been periodically featuring new classical albums. And I don't often do albums from the opera world, and this isn't from a single opera. This is a debut album from a young South Korean soprano. She lives in the United States now. She did a master's and a special opera certificate at Juilliard, and now lives in New York, where she has been singing with the Met. And her name is Hera Haesang Park, and the album name is just I Am Hera. And she signed in May with Deutsche Grammophon, which is one of the premier classical recording albums in the world. And so she is an up-and-comer. And I feel terrible for her because she's right at the start of a very promising career. And the pandemic has canceled so many of her roles that she had scheduled with the Metropolitan Opera and in other places. And so she released an album instead of some of her favorite arias. She has a very clear, pure soprano voice. Sometimes operatic sopranos can be so heavy sounding, and their vibratos can be so fast or so wide that it's hard to tell what pitch they're singing sometimes. Hers is the opposite of that. It's crystal clear. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous voice. And the range of arias she includes on this album, she says, represents kind of her spiritual journey to becoming the kind of singer that she is working to become. And she concludes the album with 2 songs by Korean composers that are just gorgeous. So if you're not an opera fan, or if you're not a fan of operatic style singing, you probably won't enjoy the album because it is pure opera arias. Things like Puccini and Mozart, where she just excels. Her aria from La Boheme is just gorgeous. But if you like opera at all, please give this album a try. She is somebody who will be with us for years and years and years because she's very young and just has such a promising future. And so I wanted to feature her album because it's a debut. I didn't know about her till I listened to the album and then did some research on her career, and she is just a spectacular voice. So it's called I Am Hera from Deutsche Grammophon, and she's singing with the Vienna Philharmonic. So she's not starting with a shabby organization. So that's what I've been up to. I've been reading, I've been watching. I hope you have lots of things to read and watch that are keeping you going during these times, and I will talk to you all again soon. Bye, everybody.